Now we're moving on to the last big section of the IEP, which is measurement. And measurement is huge. Now, I've alluded to measurement a number of times now, and I started to whet your appetite by sharing this data with you, which is an example of measurement. This is an example of very reasonable to obtain within session data that then can be aggregated so that I could see that if this is just one sitting, 1 day worth of data, then I can look across weeks of data to get the larger trend and know that things are working. And this data that you're looking at right now, the other advantage of looking at this is it tells you that the student is learning, that you're moving towards the short-term objective that you're seeking. It also tells you that your strategies and tactics are effective. If you saw this line flat or not going up, you would know you have a problem. If you saw the words correct going up, but the errors stayed high, you know you still have a problem. And all problems are not student problems, they're instructional problems. The question would then become, all right, we're getting more correct words per minute, but we're not getting our error rate down. What part of our tactics is lacking in this regard? And what do we do about it, right? So it's kind of the starting with one of the punchlines of data. It tells you that when it's working, and it also tells you when it's not working, and that allows you to make data-based decisions. All right, so our beliefs when it comes to measurements: anything worth teaching is worth measuring, and everything that is taught can be measured. There are people out there who will say, but you can't really measure learning. And that's a concern, that's a bit of a red flag. What do you mean you can't measure learning? You can't measure true learning. Well then, how do you know that anything's happened, right? Anything can be boiled down to or reduced to action, to what people do, right? If it's something more sophisticated like understanding the nuances of Shakespeare, how do you measure that? How do you know the person has learned it? Probably because they talk to you about it, and that's what you take as your measure of their learning. But you can make that tangible, right? You can make that operational. You can make it something that they, question and answer, or some type of quiz that is a proxy of their true understanding. Anything can be made measurable. The challenge is really just to imagine how to make it measurable, as opposed to think there are some things that just can't be measured, right? That's inconsistent with the scientist practitioner model of being a special educator, right? If it can't be measured, it brings it into the realm of like mysticism. No, we are scientist practitioners. We believe in measurement. This is from some ministry documentation in Ontario. The IEP should be reviewed and updated regularly, at least once in every reporting period. Interesting that they say that in Ontario. And based on ongoing and continuous evaluation of the student's progress. So if you review it even each reporting period or less or more, you're reviewing it based on evaluation of the student's progress. How do you evaluate that? That's with data, right? Quantification. We want to see numbers. Ideally, we would like to see things on graphs, as crazy as that may sound, and I will share some of that with you. Continuing with our beliefs around measurements, not all data are created equal. Direct observation, seeing the phenomenon of interest, observing the student doing what we want them to do, whether that is a self-determination goal, or that's literacy or numeracy or social communication, social interaction, turn-taking. We want to be able to observe it and count it or time it and measure it and quantify it. All of this, even if done less regularly, not even every day, is better than an anecdote, right? An anecdote is just somebody's opinion at a point in time. And this is where you get things like, yeah, it seems to be getting better. I think he's doing okay. Yeah, I think that it's emerging, right? One of those meaningless categorizations of reporting language. Anecdotes are problematic. They are entirely subjective. And the Ministry of Education in British Columbia actually, in their documentation, recommends against the use of anecdotes. Doesn't necessarily explicitly forbade anecdotes, but it makes it pretty clear that they should be the strategy of last resort. And so I'm very pleased if I see an IEP that has 0 anecdotes. And quite often, again, when you're looking at the IEP document, you'll see here's the short-term objective, and then in the next column, here's our strategies, and then in the next column, measurement or data or accountability. And in that column, it'll often just be one word that says anecdote. And then at the reporting period, you can just ask somebody, how's it going? And you can record their anecdote, and apparently that suffices, that satisfies what's required. We shouldn't be satisfied by that. I remember an IEP meeting at the end of a school year a number of years ago, where I went with a parent client to meet with a special educator. And the parent asked the teacher about anecdotes. The parent was actually quite upset by this idea of anecdotes. And one of the goals we were talking about was her son, her about to be adult son's ability to problem solve. It was on his IEP. And in discussion with the special educator, Mom was saying, well, how do you know that he can problem solve? And the response was, well, we ask his teachers. And Mom asked, what does that look like? Like, could you just go ask his math teacher, and the math teacher could say, oh yeah, I remember one time back in March where there was this issue and he seemed to be okay with it. He asked me and he solved that problem. So yeah, I think he's got the problem solving. So really you can come up with a goal in September, hopefully, and then at some point in the year, somebody once sees an opportunity where this happened and says, yeah, I think he's got it. And then we say achieved at the end of the year, right? That single subjective anecdote, that one opinion at that one point in time is adequate. And the kind of sheepish response was like, yeah, we can do that. And the mom was understandably very upset by that. Like, this is unacceptable. There's no accountability around this. I don't really believe that my son has learned the problem solving that we set out to achieve. So really, the data should deliver that believability. You can look at the data and go, this convinces me that we've made progress, right? The data should tell its own story. That's part of the beauty of having data, is that we don't need to sit around an IEP meeting or review meeting and just ask, how are things going with this objective? What do you think is going on here? Do you think the student is making progress? We shouldn't need to ask those questions, because if we're asking those questions, we are inviting anecdotes. And I feel that I'm making the strong case here that we should not be satisfied with anecdotes. They don't really have a place in educational measurement. They are not a valid standard of evidence in research. We should be able to look at the short-term objective and then flip the page and look at the data and look at the data, and the data will tell a picture and say, this is working or this isn't working, and then we'll make a change of tactic, right? That can seem like science fiction, but we don't do that. That can't happen. It does happen. It just doesn't happen enough. And the intent of IEPs is this is what should be happening. And if our intent of being here today and educating yourselves is to be better at doing this, then you just need to think about what's the next evolution of what I'm doing that I can start to work towards this. Not necessarily making a huge change overnight, but moving towards this. So, other types of data. You've got summative data and formative data. And if you want to memorize, try to come up with a way to remember, what does summative mean? What does formative mean? Summative means to summarize. And you summarize at the end of something. So if we have a goal, let's say that I have a class, I'm teaching a class, and there's no assessment in my class until the final exam. The final exam is worth 100% of your grade. That's a pretty high stakes final exam. One of the challenges there is you don't know how you're doing as a student until you've written the final exam. And I don't know how I've been effective as a teacher until I see my students have written the final exam. And if the student writes the final exam and gets 100%, then everything was good. The teaching was effective, the learning was optimal. But if the student does poorly or fails that exam, you don't know until the end, when it's literally too late, that the instruction was ineffective and the learning, therefore, was subpar, right? So summative does have a time and a place. It is, of course, used in universities and high schools and things like that. But we would prefer to have measurement that lets us know how we're doing along the way. So summative does have its place, but we would like to shift our focus to formative assessment and think of the root of formative is to inform. This is assessment that informs our teaching so we can make data-based decisions. So I like to say that IEPs are attracted to, they like formative assessment. Formative assessment means you don't do it at the end, you do it repeatedly throughout. So that example of reading data I gave you would be a type of formative assessment because you're doing it regularly. So you can repeat this as much as possible. Like the question right after lunch was, how do I ensure enough dosage of intervention of teaching if my students' schedule is impacted by COVID and the opportunities are less? you do the best you can. And the same is true with data. You don't have to measure everything every day. Don't misunderstand me, think that I'm pushing that potentially unachievable goal. Some things can be counted every day. Some things you could decide to count weekly. Some things you could decide to count monthly. If you do any of this, you are doing better data collection, right? My goal at the beginning of this morning, I said, we want to be better at most of these things, but we just want to get some data, because the baseline, the current state of affairs, is that we're really not getting a whole lot of data on IEPs in most cases, and I don't think that's an overgeneralization. So with daily, like counting peer initiations, if it's peer initiations at recess, and the education assistant who's tied to that student is out at recess, they could observe and count those initiations. That would be a very sensitive measure to know that you've achieved your outcome. You could do less than that. You could do every second day. You could do once a week. But the more you measure it, the more you'll know that your tactics are working and that the students actually achieved something, and you can happily go back to your IEP document, cross it off, and move on to other business and go to the next evolution of what you're trying to teach. Some things like teaching typing, yeah, we could take data every day, or if we know we're religiously practicing it every day, then maybe every Friday we take data on the typing. The question is it sensitive to change? Because we don't take data for the sake of taking data. Data is a tool to tell us if we're being effective. And you use different tools for different reasons, and you can use the same tool in different ways, right? There's no standard way to do this. So think about, what's the most effective tool for me? What will get the job done, quite literally? If once a week probe data for typing is going to work, that works, right? We don't need to take more data than necessary. There is such a thing as too much data if it's unnecessary. We don't want to engage in the effort of taking data if it's not actually going to be used, because then we know people will stop taking data. Something like toilet training, we can just count monthly accidents, and across September, October, November, December, by Christmas time, we can report our accidents have gone from 5 per week down to 1 per week, and now we know we're on the right trajectory. This is a helpful thing to keep in mind. It's called an IEP matrix. So this is to help guide teachers, and if you've got high school in particular where you're going to multiple classes, this can be particularly helpful. It also applies all through elementary school, helpful for the teacher in the EA to know when you have IEP objectives identified, in which classes can you be teaching these things? When should you expect to teach these things? So you see down the left side are all of the objectives, and don't worry about what those actual objectives are, they're just for instance. And then you look across in language arts, you check all of the objectives that make sense to teach in language arts. A lot of things make sense to teach in language arts for the student, not everything. Right? You'll notice over here in phys ed, there are certain things, and in art class, and during recess, lunch, and transitions, that these are not optimal times to teach these things. It's good for staff to know when they are expected to be implementing IEP objectives and the class periods or routines within the day in which they don't have to be implementing those things. So this is just an organizational system. Here's an example for a grade 10 student. And the thing that probably strikes you here is that it's everything, right? Every class is a potential opportunity for teaching this student's short-term objectives this particular year, right? So that makes it very clear. This is a nice, simple way to just kind of organize at the end of the IEP, whether it's kindergarten or grade 12 or anywhere in between, when are these things going to get done? It's a great way for the special educator, the classroom teacher, the resource teacher to earn the trust of the family. Because one of the things that I mentioned yesterday is families are often unsure of how this looks outside the IEP meeting, right? They come into the IEP meeting, they understand these things are supposed to happen, but then they leave and they don't understand necessarily on a daily basis, how is this happening? Where is this happening? This makes it pretty clear where the teaching of each objective is going to be occurring, right? And then students, the parent knows, if my student had, a lot of math time and social studies time today that I remember from their IEP, these are the things that were probably worked on today, right? Not necessarily every day, but you get the broad idea.